I always thought I knew who I was, until the night my son came into my room and awakened feelings I never knew existed. About love and desire, it was one of those afternoons that seemed to stretch endlessly. The house was quiet, unusually so. Sarah, my wife, had gone into town to run errands, leaving me alone with him, my son, Ethan. It wasn't the first time we'd been left alone, just the two of us. But today felt different. There was something in the air that made my skin prickle, an undercurrent of tension I couldn't quite place. He sat at the far end of the couch, scrolling through his phone, a faint smile flickering across his face every now and then. I watched him from the corner of my eye, trying not to stare, but failing miserably. Ethan had always been a good kid, bright, kind, full of life. But the boy who had left for college a year ago wasn't the same as the one who had returned. It wasn't just the broader shoulders or the hint of stubble on his jawline, it was the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. He looked older, more sure of himself, and yet distant. I nursed my beer, letting the coolness of the bottle ground me as my thoughts spiraled. I wanted to say something, to fill the silence that hung heavy between us, but the words wouldn't come. What could I say? That I'd noticed the way his laughter didn't quite reach his eyes anymore, that I missed the easy camaraderie we used to share. I took another sip, the bitter taste of the beer doing little to calm the unease coiling in my chest. "You've changed," I said finally, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He glanced up from his phone, his expression unreadable. "Everyone changes, Dad," he said lightly, but there was an edge to his voice, a sharpness that made me flinch. "I didn't mean it like that," I said quickly, trying to backtrack. "I just meant, I don't know, you seem different, older." He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's what happens when you go to college," he said, his tone carefully neutral. The conversation ended there, the silence rushing back in like a wave. I hated this. I hated how awkward things had become between us, how every interaction felt like walking on eggshells. Ethan had always been easy to talk to, the kind of kid who could make anyone feel at ease. But now it was like there was a wall between us, one I didn't know how to tear down. As the afternoon wore on, the tension only grew. I found myself watching him more than I should, noticing things I hadn't before. The way his jaw tightened when he thought I wasn't looking. The way he ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a kid. And then there were the moments when our eyes met, fleeting and charged, like we were both waiting for the other to speak, but neither of us did. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I set my beer down and leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "So," I said, breaking the silence, "you must have met some interesting people at school. Anyone special?" It was a harmless question, the kind of thing any father might ask. But the moment the words left my mouth, I saw the way he tensed. His fingers tightened around his phone, and his eyes darted away from mine. "No one serious," he said after a moment, his voice carefully casual. I nodded, trying to ignore the way my chest tightened. "That's good," I said softly. "It's good to have fun before things get too complicated." As soon as the words were out, I regretted them. They hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. Ethan's face flushed, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Yeah, you're right," he said, his tone clipped. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. I don't know what possessed me to move closer. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was instinctive, like my body was acting on its own. Before I knew it, I was sliding across the couch, closing the distance between us. Ethan froze, his eyes wide and uncertain. I could feel the heat radiating off him, the nervous energy that seemed to fill the room. "Dad," he started, his voice shaky. I reached out, resting my hand lightly on his knee. It was a small gesture, meant to be comforting, but the moment my hand touched him, something shifted. I felt it in the way he tensed, the way his breath hitched ever so slightly. "You've grown up a lot," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're not a kid anymore." The words hung between us, heavy and loaded with meaning. I didn't know why I said them, why I felt the need to say them, but once they were out, there was no taking them back. Ethan looked away, his face flushed. I think I'm going to head upstairs," he said abruptly, standing up. I watched him go, my hand still resting on the couch where his knee had been moments before. The tension in the room didn't ease when he left. If anything, it grew heavier, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. I stayed there for a long time, staring at the spot where he'd been. My thoughts were a tangled mess, a storm of emotions I couldn't begin to untangle. When Sarah came home later that evening, I pretended everything was fine. I smiled, helped her unload the groceries, and listened to her talk about her day, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment on the couch over and over again. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the fan overhead. I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan, about the way he'd looked at me before he left the room. There was something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. Fear, confusion, or was it something else entirely? I sighed, running a hand over my face. Whatever it was, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something had changed between us, something I didn't understand, but couldn't deny, and it scared me. It scared me because I didn't know what to do, how to fix this growing distance between us. I wanted to talk to him, to figure out what was going on, but every time I tried, the words got stuck in my throat. Maybe tomorrow will be different. Maybe tomorrow I'd find the courage to say what needed to be said. But as I lay there, listening to the quiet sounds of the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow wouldn't be enough, that whatever was happening between us wasn't something I could fix with words, and that terrified me more than anything else. The night was still, almost unnaturally so, the kind of silence that wraps around you, heavy and suffocating. The fan above me spun lazily, its faint hum doing little to distract me from the thoughts swirling in my mind. Sleep had been elusive these past few days, ever since Ethan came back home. It wasn't just the conversations, or the lack of them, that unsettled me. It was the way he looked at me, like he was searching for something, a reassurance I didn't know how to give. Or maybe it was something deeper, something I wasn't ready to admit to myself. I turned over, pulling the blanket higher, hoping the cocoon of fabric might offer some semblance of comfort. Sarah was out of town, staying overnight with her sister, leaving the house feeling emptier than usual. It was just me and Ethan, and though the house was quiet, my thoughts were anything but. I drifted off, until I heard the soft creak of my bedroom door. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The sound was faint, barely audible over the fan, but it pulled me from the fog of sleep. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing steady, waiting for whatever or whoever had caused the noise to pass. But the sound of footsteps followed, light and hesitant, growing closer with each passing second. I opened my eyes just a crack, enough to see the faint outline of a figure standing in the doorway. My heart quickened, though I couldn't explain why. "Ethan?" I murmured, my voice groggy with sleep. He hesitated, hovering near the doorway, like he wasn't sure if he should step inside. The faint glow of the hallway light cast his face in shadow, but I could still make out the nervous set of his jaw, the way his hands fidgeted at his sides. "I didn't mean to wake you," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's fine," I said, sitting up and rubbing my eyes. "What's wrong?" He took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was afraid of startling me. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, his voice low and uneven. I needed to talk." I nodded, patting the edge of the bed. "Come on, sit down." He hesitated again, his gaze flickering between me and the empty space beside me. Finally, he crossed the room and sat down, keeping a careful distance between us. The mattress dipped slightly under his weight, and I could feel the tension radiating off him. He was fidgeting again, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he stared down at them. "What's on your mind?" I asked gently, leaning back against the headboard. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair, a nervous habit I recognized all too well. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear him. "Do you ever feel like you don't know who you are anymore?" he asked, his words halting and uncertain. The question caught me off guard. I studied him for a moment, trying to gauge what he was really asking. "Sometimes," I said carefully. "It's normal to feel that way, especially when you're going through a lot of changes." He nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on his hands. "It's just college was supposed to make things clearer, you know? Like, I thought I'd go there and figure out who I am, what I want, but now I feel more confused than ever." I reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. He flinched slightly at the contact, but he didn't pull away. "That's part of growing up," I said. "You don't have to have everything figured out right now. It's okay to take your time." He finally looked up at me, his eyes searching mine. There was something in his gaze, something raw and vulnerable that made my chest tighten. "Do you ever feel like you're drawn to something you shouldn't be?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The question hung in the air between us, heavy and loaded with unspoken meaning. I didn't know how to respond, didn't know what he was really asking, but I could see the desperation in his eyes, the way he was waiting for me to say something, anything that might make sense of whatever he was feeling. Sometimes, I said finally, my voice soft. But just because you feel that way doesn't mean it's wrong. Feelings are complicated. They don't always make sense, and that's okay. He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping back to his hands. It's just, I don't know how to talk about it. I don't know if I can. You can talk to me, I said firmly. Whatever it is, you don't have to go through it alone. He didn't respond, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease slightly. For a moment, we sat there in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the fan overhead. I thought he might leave, that our conversation was over, but then he shifted closer, his leg brushing against mine. The contact was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it sent a jolt through me. I froze, unsure of what to do, unsure of what was happening. Dad, he said softly, his voice trembling. I turned to look at him, and the intensity in his gaze took my breath away. There was something in his eyes I couldn't quite place. Something vulnerable and raw, but also something else. Ethan, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, what's going on? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out, his hand hovering just above mine before he finally let it rest there. His touch was tentative, almost hesitant, but the warmth of his skin sent a shiver down my spine. I don't know how to say it, he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. I feel like I'm losing my mind. You're not, I said quickly, my hand tightening around his instinctively. You're just trying to figure things out, and that's okay. Whatever it is, we'll get through it together. He nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on our hands, his thumb brushing lightly over my knuckles. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it felt significant. Thank you, he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. For what? I asked, my voice steady despite the unease building in my chest. For being here, he said simply. I didn't know how to respond, so I did instead. I gave his hand a reassuring squeeze, hoping it would be enough. After a while, he pulled away, standing up and giving me a small, almost shy smile. I should let you sleep, he said, his voice light but still tinged with uncertainty. Good night, Ethan, I said, watching as he walked to the door. He paused in the doorway, glancing back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, and then he was gone. The soft click of the door closing behind him, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I lay back down, staring at the ceiling as my mind raced. Something had shifted between us tonight. Something I didn't fully understand, but I couldn't ignore it. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure what to do next. The next day, we decided to go for a drive, or maybe to find answers to our questions. The road stretched ahead of us, long and winding, disappearing into the golden horizon. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm amber glow over the landscape. It was one of those perfect days, cool enough to keep the windows down, the breeze carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and fresh earth. Ethan sat beside me in the passenger seat, his arm resting on the open window, his face turned slightly toward the breeze. He looked peaceful, at least on the surface, but I could tell there was something simmering beneath that calm exterior. He hadn't said much since we left, and I hadn't pushed him. We hadn't planned this road trip. It was spur of the moment. One of those ideas born out of the kind of awkward silences that had been filling the house lately. He'd mentioned wanting to get out for a while, to clear his head, and I'd suggested we take a drive. I thought maybe the open road would give us the space to talk, to work through whatever it was that had been weighing on him, and if I was honest, on me too. The miles passed in silence, the only sounds the steady hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the wind. I stole glances at him whenever I could, trying to read his expression, but his face was a mask, giving nothing away. Beautiful, isn't it? I said finally, breaking the silence. I gestured toward the fields of wildflowers that stretched out on either side of the road, their colors vibrant in the fading light. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Yeah, he said softly. We drove for a while longer before I pulled over onto a gravel path that led to a small clearing. It was a spot I'd discovered years ago, a place I used to go when I needed to think. The clearing overlooked a wide expanse of rolling hills, the view stretching out for miles. Ethan stepped out of the car and walked to the edge of the clearing, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I followed, standing a few feet away, giving him space, but staying close enough that he knew I was there. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was heavy, filled with things we hadn't yet said. Thanks for bringing me here, he said finally, his voice barely more than a whisper. Anytime, I said, leaning against the hood of the car. I figured you could use a change of scenery. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I've been thinking a lot lately, he said after a moment, his voice low and hesitant. About what? I asked, keeping my tone casual. About everything, he said, his words halting. He turned to look at me then, his eyes searching mine. About us. The way he said it made my chest tighten, a mix of apprehension and something else I couldn't quite name. What about us? I asked carefully. He hesitated, his hands fidgeting at his sides. I don't know how to say this, he admitted, his voice barely audible. Just say it, I said gently. Whatever it is, you can tell me. He looked away, his gaze dropping to the ground. It's not that simple, he said. I waited, giving him the time he needed. Whatever he was trying to say, I could tell it was tearing him apart. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. I love you, Dad, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Not just as my father. I love you more than that. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken for far too long. My breath caught in my chest, my mind reeling as I tried to process what he just said. Ethan, I said finally, my voice soft but steady. You're my son. I love you too, but... Don't, he said quickly, cutting me off. Please don't say it's wrong or that I'm confused. I've spent months trying to fight this, trying to convince myself it's just a phase, but it's not. I can't stop feeling this way. His voice cracked, and I could see the tears welling up in his eyes. He looked so young and vulnerable in that moment, like the little boy I used to comfort when he had nightmares. I didn't know what to say. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, shock, confusion, and something deeper. Something I didn't want to name. Ethan, I said again, stepping closer. This is complicated. I don't know what to say right now, but I need you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes, the fear that my words might just be a way to avoid the truth. I'm sorry, he said softly, his voice trembling. I know this isn't what you want to hear. I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. He flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. It's okay to feel confused, I said. It's okay to feel whatever you're feeling, but we need to talk about this, to figure it out together. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine for something. Understanding maybe, or forgiveness. I don't want to lose you, he said, his voice breaking. You won't, I said firmly. You're my son, Ethan. Nothing will ever change that. The words felt hollow, even as I said them, because the truth was everything had already changed. We stood there for a long time, the silence stretching between us. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the clearing in shadow, the fading light painting the sky in deep hues of amber and indigo. I took a hesitant step closer, my heart beat loud in the stillness. He turned to face me, his eyes meeting mine, and in that fleeting moment, the air between us shifted. I leaned in, slow and uncertain, until the warmth of his breath mingled with mine. Then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, our lips met, a tentative brush that quickly deepened, igniting something raw and electric. The world around us faded. The only thing that mattered was the connection, the unspoken truth sealed in that single lingering kiss. Finally, Ethan stepped back, wiping at his eyes. We should probably head back, he said, his voice quiet but steady. I nodded, knowing there was nothing more to say for now. The drive home was silent, but it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. It was heavy with unspoken words, but it also felt lighter somehow, like we'd taken the first step toward understanding, even if we didn't have all the answers yet. When we pulled into the driveway, Ethan turned to me, his expression hesitant but hopeful. Thanks for today, he said softly. Anytime, I said, giving him a small smile. He nodded and got out of the car, disappearing into the house without another word. I stayed in the car for a while, staring out into the darkness, my thoughts racing. I didn't know what the future held for us, but I knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same again. The house was unusually quiet that evening, bathed in the warm glow of the dim lamps that Sarah always insisted made it feel cozier. She had gone to visit her mother earlier in the day and wasn't due back until later that night, leaving Ethan and me alone again. We had spent most of the day in relative silence. There was still an unspoken tension between us from our conversation during the road trip, and I wasn't sure how to bridge it. I couldn't stop thinking about what he had said, the raw confession of his feelings for me, and the weight of my own inability to respond. Now we were in the lounge, sitting on opposite ends of the couch. A movie was playing on the television, but I wasn't paying attention to it. My focus kept drifting to him. He wasn't looking at the screen either. His gaze was fixed on the carpet, lost in thought. "Ethan," I said, finally breaking the silence. He looked up, startled, as though he'd forgotten I was even there. "Yeah?" "I've been thinking about what you said," I began, my voice careful, deliberate. His expression shifted immediately. Hope, fear, and apprehension all flickering across his face in quick succession. "And?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't know how to make sense of this," I admitted, "but I know I care about you more than anything. I need time to figure this out." Ethan nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging with a mix of relief and resignation. "I get it," he said softly. "I don't expect you to have all the answers. He paused, his voice catching. "I just needed you to know how I feel." The vulnerability in his voice hit me like a punch to the gut. Before I could stop myself, I moved closer, sliding across the couch until I was sitting right next to him. "You're not alone in this," I said, placing a hand on his knee. He looked up at me then, his eyes wide and searching, and for a moment the world seemed to shrink until it was just the two of us. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words and emotions too big to contain. And then, before I could think better of it, I leaned in. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something I had even considered. But in that moment, it felt inevitable. His breath hitched as our faces drew closer, and then our lips met. The kiss was tentative at first, hesitant and uncertain, but it didn't stay that way for long. There was a desperation to it, a kind of unspoken understanding that this moment was both wrong and inevitable. His hands moved to my shoulders, clutching at me, as though I might disappear if he let go. Time seemed to stand still as we sat there, lost in each other. The movie played on in the background, forgotten, its sounds muffled against the pounding of my heart. And then the front door opened. The sound was like a bucket of ice water, jolting us both back to reality. We pulled apart abruptly, our breaths coming in ragged gasps, and turned toward the source of the noise. Sarah stood in the doorway, her coat still half on, her purse dangling from one hand. Her expression was a mixture of confusion and shock, her eyes darting between us as though trying to make sense of what she had just seen. "What is going on here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Neither of us said anything. The room felt like it had been plunged into an icy silence, the kind that presses down on you and makes it hard to breathe. "Sarah," I began, standing up and taking a step toward her. She held up a hand, stopping me in my tracks. "Don't," she said sharply. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. "I want an explanation now." Ethan stood up then, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "It's my fault," he said quickly, his voice breaking. "Don't blame him. It's me." Sarah's gaze snapped to him, her expression shifting from shock to something closer to disbelief. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "What do you mean it's you?" I told him how I feel," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "I told him I love him more than I should." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Sarah's face went slack with shock, her hand flying to her mouth. "Ethan?" I said, my voice firm but gentle. "Stop." "No," he said, turning to face me. His eyes were wet with unshed tears, his expression defiant. "She deserves to know the truth." Sarah took a shaky step forward, her voice trembling. "You're telling me this has been happening? Under my roof?" "Sarah, it's not what you think," I said quickly. "This is complicated. I didn't what?" She snapped, her voice rising. "Didn't mean for it to happen? Didn't think it was wrong? It's not his fault." Ethan interjected, his voice growing stronger. "I came to him. I made him feel this way. He didn't do anything wrong." "Stop," I said sharply, my patience fraying. I turned to Sarah, trying to explain. "He's confused, Sarah. He's been struggling with his feelings, and I've been trying to help him. That's all this is. Help him." "Help him?" Sarah repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "Is that what you call this?" "Mom, please," Ethan said, stepping forward. "You don't understand." "No, I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I don't understand how this could happen. I don't understand how you," she turned to me, her eyes filled with anger and betrayal, "how you could let this happen." "I didn't let anything happen," I said firmly. "I've been trying to figure this out, just like him. This isn't what you think." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this right now," she said, her voice breaking. She turned and walked toward the door, her movements quick and frantic. "Sarah, wait!" I called after her, but she didn't stop. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving Ethan and me alone in this suffocating silence. For a long time, neither of us said anything. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on us, making it hard to breathe. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry," he said, his eyes filled with tears. "It's not your fault," I said, though the words felt hollow. He shook his head, his shoulders sagging. "I should have kept my feelings to myself. I've ruined everything." "No," I said firmly, stepping closer. "You haven't ruined anything. This is complicated, but we'll figure it out together." He looked up at me then, his expression filled with a mix of hope and despair. "Do you mean that?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "But we need to take this one step at a time. For now, let's just breathe." He nodded, though the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. The house felt cavernous, the silence stretching endlessly in the wake of the slammed door. Sarah's departure left a void, the air heavy with the aftermath of unspoken truths and shattered illusions. The dim light from the lamps cast long shadows across the room, flickering as if unsure of their place in the darkness. I walked to the window, staring out into the night. The faint hum of crickets was the only sound, a stark contrast to the storm raging in my mind. Beyond the driveway, the world seemed unchanged, calm, indifferent, yet inside, everything had shifted. The invisible line we had crossed days ago was obliterated, leaving only raw emotions and an uncertain future. Ethan moved to the sofa, sinking into it as though his legs could no longer hold him. I turned to look at him, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the television. His eyes were red, his expression a mix of anguish and vulnerability. For a moment, I wanted to reach out, to close the distance between us, but I didn't. Instead, I sat beside him, the silence binding us together in a way words never could.